Hey everybody, this is Moses from Random Walk. Gonna give you your 5-minute rundown of the stuff that mattered this week. I don't know, maybe this decade, this century. It's stuff that matters. It's interesting. It's fun. It's data driven. You'll like it. You'll like me, I hope. Otherwise, don't watch or do. Just don't tell me. Anyway, I'm gonna try and keep this quick because I go on for a while. And we got a lot to cover. Anyway, we start out with the what I call scatter plots. It's really 5 different little data driven observations about stuff that I think you probably haven't otherwise learned about and still nonetheless interesting. And they're not necessarily related to one another, but they do fit into broader themes, right? The idea here is a mosaic approach to learning, right? Lots of little data points that comprise a bigger picture. And it's not linear because fuck that. Anyway, starting from the top. So first one is people having trouble falling asleep. So this is from SimilarWeb's little report. SimilarWeb is they do web traffic. Like they look at what people are clicking on, what they're watching on. This was a little report on top YouTube searches. I think it's interesting. Partly I think it's interesting just to see what other people are thinking about, and not to become overly indexed to yourself, especially weirdo like me, like the stuff that I read. Just listen to what other people read, but what other people read is probably more relevant than I read. Anyway, so look at this list. Most of it I've heard of and makes sense, but some of this is like totally bizarre, including the number one on the top with 40.40 million searches, which is almost double Mr. Beast. For instance, ASMR. What is ASMR? It's something called autonomous sensory meridian response. I don't know, hadn't heard of it, but basically it's a warm and fuzzy feeling that people get when they listen to somebody speaking very, very quietly into a microphone. I guess they use it for anxiety or fall asleep or some combination thereof. Totally bizarre. I clicked on one of the top videos. It's fucking off. Don't ever watch it. You're not missing anything. It's incredibly stupid. The longer it went on, the more angry and irritated I got. I just wanted to punch this girl in the face. And she tried to sell me a cork cutout of a piece of toast so that I could drum my fingertips on it just like her. I hated it. I hated her. I hated everything about it. I don't usually feel this strongly about other people's tastes and preferences, but in this case, something is terribly wrong. Anyway, why do I bring this up? Not just to hate on the ASMR people, but it is a recurring observation that young people are just anxious and they're depressed and they're looking for ways to be less anxious, less depressed. I have some ideas as to what it might be, but right now I'm just making the observation that it is in fact true. And this is yet another data point in his favor. Next, the hottest thing in e-commerce. It's not really the hottest thing in e-commerce. It's lumber. No. This is interesting to me because there's something called, it's called the e-commerce S-curve. E-commerce is a big deal, right? Some of the biggest companies in the world are retail companies. Some of the biggest retail companies in the world, like Amazon, these are e-commerce companies, right? So the question is how much more room can it grow? The S-curve suggests that you have growth that is slow, then very quick, but then plateaus again at the end. And the question is we're certainly in the middle phase of the S-curve, but is that plateau in sight? One of the big reasons it might be, and I'm not necessarily persuaded by this, is that a huge part of what people buy isn't something that they can or would buy online. Things like cars, gas, right? There's both a behavioral as well as a logistical problem with some of those things. Anyway, so on this front, there's at least one behavioral change that appears to be ongoing, which is people are buying lumber on wood, which buying lumber online, which is not something they used to do before. Amazon, interestingly enough, is driving the growth, at least from the growth standpoint, but Lowe's and Home Depot certainly carry the lion's share. I don't really know why this was happening. It's still not a terribly big observation in the big scheme of things, but nonetheless, it's a pretty interesting example of a behavioral change through deliberate efforts on the part of Lowe's and Home Depot to drive more traffic over their e-commerce and loyalty programs. Presumably the pandemic helped it also, but you can see the growth continues apace. Unlike the broader lumber segment, which has contracted a bit, the online share has grown, which is just interesting to me. Make money, spend money. So what do people do when they get a little richer? Turns out they spend it on more stuff. This was from a earnings call from Upstart Holdings, which is a consumer credit company, and it's been any incremental earnings over the past quarter has been directed entirely towards higher consumption. Right? Not that counterintuitive. Why does it matter? Well, people spending more drives growth. That's good. But on the other hand, you may have heard the Federal Reserve Bank is trying to kill demand, right? They're trying to spend less. That's why they're raising interest rates. And not surprisingly, when people spend more, prices tend to go up. So if higher wages lead to higher demand and the Fed is trying to kill demand, we have a immovable object running into whatever. Doesn't matter. No. Anyway, some interesting data from an increasingly one of my favorite strong, but I like it more and more, is something called the overshoot. It basically just shows, of course, that while goods inflation has come down a bit, wage inflation has stayed fairly persistently at about 5%. Random Walk has believed for a while this has to do with the structural people shortage that we have. It's just we have an aging population, and the number of working age people is growing scarcer, and therefore the premium to being able to work will go up. So wages at 5%. Historically, inflation of goods and services and wage growth have stayed pretty close together. So that leads to really three possibilities. One, the relationship between wage growth and goods and service growth breaks, right? That we have general inflation at 2%, which is the Fed's target, but wage growth at 5%. That would be fantastic. Two, the Fed decides actually that they have to intervene more and wages stop growing at 5%. Or three, we get inflation for more and longer, which is to say the Fed is not able to hit their 2% target, and there's nothing that they can do about it. My guess is probably box two, just that I think the Fed is not ready to give up on its 2% target. It will be forced to intervene if something else doesn't intervene sooner. Next, AI is so great. We're just about to start using it. This is also a recurring random walk theme. I like these data visualizations. They do happen to show that the total user base for ChatGPT is going down. Some of the chatter around, on Reddit, etc., has also gone down. Some people might conclude that the bubble is bursting. I don't really think so. I think this is really, first of all, just the data is noisy, the infatuation period, or at least the novelty might have worn off, but I think the core users are still there. Companies are still building. It just takes time. And frankly, once the getting to chatting can indicate the getting to know you phase, whereas not chatting is the down to work phase. So if people aren't really talking about it as much, it might be because their heads down focused on it. Anyway, mostly I just thought it was pretty. Cable is dead. Long live cable. What's the point here? Again, this is a reprise, a longer running theme. I've spelled it out elsewhere. I'm not going to spend too much time on it. But basically, the basic idea, I find this generally interesting because, it's a kind of settling a debate in the real world, which you don't typically get to do. The debate had to do with the FTC, the Federal Trade Commission that regulates so-called cartels. About 20 years ago, cable companies were an unstoppable cartel, and one of the evil things that they did is they bundled content, right? That they had this captured audience, and they forced people to buy more content that they really wanted instead of offering things a la carte, right? The FTC was wrong, as it often is, and of course, I often quip that, the FTC supposedly fights cartels, but of course, it is the biggest cartel in the world, right? I can't opt out of the so-called consumer protection that the FTC offers me. I wish I could. I wish I could get the cheaper and better things that I could get if they allowed economies to scale to flourish and instead of imposing lots of costs, but I can't. Anyway, digression. Point is what happened is, of course, as streaming began to enter the marketplace, it's been slowly and steadily increasing its market share at the expense of cable. Cable companies, traditional cable companies, are dying. Is that vindication? Well, no, it's not vindication of the FTC, first of all, because it means the technology solved the problem and not the FTC didn't regulators, but also the underlying economics of a la carte offerings are exactly as the cable company said they were, which is to say, you cannot do a la carte at cheap prices at low scale. You either have to charge huge amounts of money or you have to do bundling because otherwise the economics don't work. Lo and behold, what are the streaming companies doing? They are raising prices and they are doing bundling, and they have been doing significantly for a while. Anyway, the point is here is we've come full circle exactly to where we started. The debate should be resolved for everybody. We should often conclude that the FTC is just wrong and we shouldn't pay attention to them. Of course, most people won't, but that is the correct observation. Next, the Great Wall of Text. This is the showpiece here. And again, I will try to keep it brief, not just rehash the entire thing that's written. But why does this really, really matter? Why do we really like this? Okay. Taking a step back, I think there is a broader argument here. Everybody's familiar with the last couple of years, the free money drove inflation, period is over, et cetera, zero interest rate. You get free money, prices go up. It's not real, right? Because the inflation that eats away whatever growth we may have had. The scarier possibility is that, in fact, this has been going on for a really long time, at least since the end of the Great Financial Crisis in about 2008, 2009. And we just only only noticed it fairly recently. And what do I mean by that, right? Because if you think of where growth comes from, one of the easiest, most obvious examples of where growth comes from is from people, right? More customers, right? If you're looking at any company, you said, well, my customer base is flatlining to decreasing, but don't worry, it'll be fine. You'd say, you're going to have to really persuade me on that point, because it's not impossible, right? You could get, better margins, you could sell a higher price point, but generally speaking, if somebody's core customer base was flatlining to contracting, you would not be overly optimistic about long-term growth. Well, it just so happens the United States of America, but also the developed world, our core customer base, the working age population, is flatlining to contracting. The population is aging, and the plan has really been mostly to ignore it, but otherwise to fill the ranks, to close the people gap through decent amount of immigration, bringing people from other countries, which happens to be a zero-sum game, right? Because you're taking money from other places, taking people from other places means they have fewer places there. But anyway, but the point, and the other piece of it, of course, was just the same way that the Federal Reserve is killing demand now with higher interest rates. They tried to goose up demand with low interest rates, and so they did, right? So the thesis is fairly straightforward. It's like when the natural organic demand that comes from growing people began to fall apart, the Fed filled that void with cheap, right? Now, the reason that, of course, this is a hard theory to prove, and the fact is that we have growth that's continued at pace. But what I find really interesting about this is, of course, the universities, they have the same problem. In fact, they're a microcosm of this problem. And the universities, who are their customers? Their customers are young people. And at the turn of the century, in the early 2000s, they discovered that they were having enrollment problems because they were running out of people. And so what did they decide to do? They decided to borrow a lot of money and spend it. And also they would raise tuition a bunch because guess what? That was borrowed money too, right? Student loans, sort of blown through the roof, and they were extremely cheap. And there was an implied guarantee from the federal government, maybe not. And they would spend all that money. And the plan would be, we're going to recruit out of state and international students, and eventually everything is going to be fantastic. Fast forward 20 years, it has not been fantastic. The rule here, the lesson here is that actually you cannot borrow and spend your way out of a people shortage problem. It doesn't work. Right? They took on lots of debt. They spent lots of money. They got their customers to take on lots of debt and spend lots of money. And at the end of the day, enrollment is still flat and suffering. The good times on the debt, cheap debt has run out, but all the existing debt is still very much there, and universities are in a real pickle. You can see, the differences in spending and enrollment. Spending went up, enrollment did not, which means, of course, the tuitions had to increase. Who paid for those tuitions? Well, student lenders did, in theory, at very cheap rates and, underwritten with limited diligence. And, is basically a straight transfer from lenders or student lenders straight to the universities, which they spent on growing administration, buildings, et cetera, et cetera. Again, the bet was very clear and explicit. We're going to recruit out-of-state students. We're going to recruit international students. Didn't work. First of all, we have a declining number of international students anyway, but also it's a zero-sum game, right? Because if every state university in every different state is trying to recruit everybody else's students, they all can't win unless the pie grows. But the pie wasn't growing. The pie is shrinking, which means maybe you have one or two winners, but for the most part, they're all losers. And there you go. That's just, this is enrollment and fees, but really you can think of this as revenue. It's very much parallel to taxpayer revenue, which is also similarly declining. So anyway, the point here is like, if it didn't work for universities couldn't borrow and spend their way out of declining people problem. Why does it work for the U.S. Treasury, right? Like people say, look, the consumer is great. I said, I don't know what you're talking about. Everybody's, the consumer balance sheet is fantastic. There's not a lot of consumer debt. Interest payments aren't that high. Everybody's in great position. Yeah, that's true. Because instead of having individuals borrow extra money, the federal government just borrow money for them, right? But you can't just if somebody said to you, is like, it's not the consumer credit, it's the taxpayer credit. The consumer and the taxpayer are the same thing, right? Like if you took my own balance sheet liabilities and you moved them one upstream to the federal government, the federal government is of course different from individual consumers, but it's also not that different. And you look, the federal, sure, household GDP, debt as a share of GDP is at quite reasonable levels, but federal debt as a share of GDP is at World War II levels. And the thing about World War II is like we had an enormously growing population. The tailwinds were fantastic. Now we have the opposite of that. As I say, we're on a wartime footing with no people reinforcements on the way. This is one sort of like, if you look at this is what West Virginia was facing. I call these a variant of the doom charts. As you see, there's a flatlining population, whether measured in children or childbearing people, and then eventually decline. This is what they tried to borrow and spend their way out. It did not work. Like they could not close the people gap. If you want to look at the national level, this is what it looks like at the national level. This is our sort of population begins to flatline and decline. Here's when the ZERP period kicks in. Magically, right as the population begins to flatline and decline is when federal borrowing begins to grow exponentially to fill that void. The question is of course, now that the federal government is levered to the gills and its own interest expense are blowing through the roof, and the theory is, I guess the prevailing theory is it just doesn't really matter. And of course, it would matter if that was individual consumers who had borrowed through the roof and were paying interest through the gills, but because it's the federal government that's doing it, it doesn't, I don't know, it doesn't really make sense to me. Eventually those bills will come due. We will have to pay them, or we will choose not to pay them, in which case we'll destroy our credit. But either way, the debt is real and we're on pleasant thoughts. That's it. This probably went on longer than I expected. I said too many things and spoke quickly, and you should tell me how terrible it was, or just, whatever, laugh at me later. Either way, I'm glad that you listened. Hope you enjoyed, and I will be back next week with hopefully something better. but at least not worse. I don't know. I can't promise. That's it. Hope you enjoy.